They call the 80th floor of the Blackwood Tower the summit, a place where a single stroke of a pen can relocate thousands of lives and shift the city's skyline. Most people believe the man in the $5,000 Brioni suit sitting behind the mahogany desk holds all the power. They are wrong. The real power in this room isn't holding a pen, he's holding a mop. Ethan Blackwood was a man who owned the very air the board of directors breathed. Yet to them, he was part of the furniture. He didn't have a name. He was just the help in the gray canvas uniform. But on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled of expensive espresso and corporate greed, the world would discover Ethan's one non-negotiable rule. You can play with his money, but you never, ever touch his blood. As the city's most arrogant CEO forced a dignified old man to his knees over a spilled coffee, the janitor did something the terrified executives didn't expect. He stopped cleaning. He began to judge. This is the story of how a man who was treated like trash decided to take it out. Permanently. The executive suite of Blackwood Global was a masterclass in minimalist intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Chicago fog, but inside, the atmosphere was even colder. The lighting was surgical, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished marble. Victor Hargreave, the CEO, stood at the center of the room like a king who had forgotten he was a tenant. His beard was trimmed to a lethal edge, and his voice carried the sharp, grating tone of a man who mistook cruelty for leadership. Across from him sat Samuel Blackwood. At 68, Samuel wore his age with a quiet pride, his brown sweater a soft, human contrast to the steel and glass surrounding him. He was a retired finance expert, a man who had forgotten more about wealth than Victor would ever know. But today, he was just a confused old man who had made the mistake of entering Victor's domain. In the corner, leaning against the cold glass, Ethan Blackwood watched through the reflection. His tall, athletic frame was hidden beneath the bulk of a janitor's jumpsuit, his sharp jawline shadowed by a week's worth of stubble. To Victor, Ethan was invisible, a ghost in suspenders. Ethan had spent 6 months in this disguise, testing the foundations of the empire he'd built from nothing. He had seen laziness, he had seen greed. But as he watched Victor lean over his father, gesturing dismissively at a document as if Samuel were a stray dog, Ethan felt a cold, familiar fire ignite in his chest. The ghost was about to become a god. The janitor was about to hand over the keys, but not to the man currently holding the office. He was about to unlock the cage and let the wolf out. The smell of ammonia and floor wax was Ethan Blackwood's current camouflage. It was a sharp, biting scent that masked the reality of his existence, much like the oversized gray canvas uniform that swallowed his athletic frame. As he pushed the heavy yellow mop bucket across the polished marble of the lobby, Ethan kept his head down, his gaze fixed on the rhythmic, circular motions of the mop. To the hundreds of employees rushing past him, he was a non-entity. He was a piece of the architecture, a human-shaped shadow that cleared away their footprints and emptied their trash. They didn't see the calloused precision of his hands or the way his eyes, calm, cold, and predatory, calculated the efficiency of every department they passed. 6 months ago, Ethan had stood on the roof of this very building, looking out over a city he had conquered by the age of 30. But the view from the top had become distorted by layers of middle management and sycophants. He had realized that the truth of a company isn't found in a quarterly earnings report. It is found in the way a supervisor speaks to a subordinate when they think no one important is listening. He stopped near a bank of gold leaf elevators, the Summit Express line. His reflection in the brass doors showed a man with a week's growth of stubble and eyes that carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. He adjusted the heavy suspenders of his uniform, feeling the hidden weight of the master key card tucked into a secret lining near his chest. A piece of plastic that could shut down the city's power grid or drain the company's offshore accounts in seconds. The lobby was a theater of status. He watched as a junior executive berated a courier for a 30-second delay, the executive's face flushed with the cheap high of borrowed power. Ethan recorded the name on the man's badge in his mind. Deleted, he thought. That man would be gone by Monday, and he would never know that the man cleaning the scuff marks off his Italian loafers was the one who had signed his termination papers. Ethan moved toward the service elevator, his movements slow and deliberate. He had to play the part. The ghost in the gray uniform was his most dangerous role yet, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at his empire, he was looking through it. He was looking for a rot that he feared was spreading to the very top. A rot he suspected was embodied by the man he had personally appointed to lead in his absence, Victor Hargreave. As the service elevator doors creaked shut, Ethan pulled a small, encrypted device from his pocket. A single notification blinked on the screen. His father, Samuel, had just checked into security at the front desk. The game was no longer just about business. It was about to become a reckoning. The silence on the 80th floor was not the peaceful kind. It was a pressurized, artificial quiet that made the ears ring. Here, the air was thinner and the stakes were higher. Ethan moved his mop across the threshold of the open-plan executive wing, where the rising stars of Blackwood Global sat in glass cubicles that looked more like display cases than workspaces. He watched a young analyst, barely out of college, staring at a screen with eyes red from a 30-hour shift. The boy's hands shook as he reached for a lukewarm cup of coffee, but he didn't dare stand up to stretch. In Victor's world, movement was seen as a lack of focus, and focus was the only currency that bought survival. "You missed a spot, Janitor." The voice was like a whip. Ethan didn't flinch. He slowly turned to see a mid-level manager named Marcus, a man who modeled his entire personality after Victor's cruelty. Marcus pointed a polished finger at a microscopic streak of water on the marble. "My apologies," Ethan murmured, his voice low and gravelly, carefully stripped of its natural command. He bent down to wipe the floor, feeling Marcus's gaze on the back of his neck. The predatory stare of a man who only felt tall when he was stepping on someone else. "The board meeting starts in 10 minutes, Marcus snapped, checking a watch that likely cost more than a janitor's annual salary. "If I see a single footprint near the conference room door, you'll be looking for a new alleyway to sweep by sundown. Do you understand?" Ethan looked up, just for a second. The intensity in his gaze was enough to make Marcus take a half step back, though the manager didn't know why. For a heartbeat, the power dynamic in the hallway shifted, the invisible man suddenly feeling like the heaviest presence in the room. "Crystal clear," Ethan said. Marcus huffed, adjusting his tie to hide his sudden unease, and hurried toward the boardroom. Ethan watched him go, his jaw tightening. This was the cost of his absence. Silence didn't mean peace, it meant fear. It meant that his father's philosophy of leadership through service had been gutted and replaced with dominance through terror. He moved toward the main boardroom doors, the epicenter of the rot. Through the heavy oak, he could hear the muffled, sharp tones of Victor Hargreaves' voice. Victor was holding court, laughing at a joke made at the expense of a struggling subsidiary. Ethan gripped the handle of his mop until his knuckles turned white. He had seen enough of the culture. Now he was waiting for the catalyst. He didn't have to wait long. The elevator at the far end of the hall chimed, the soft, melodic sound signaling a guest. The doors slid open to reveal Samuel Blackwood, holding a weathered leather briefcase and looking for his son. The lamb had entered the slaughterhouse, and the wolf was already baring his teeth. Samuel Blackwood stepped out of the elevator, his sensible brown loafers silent on the expensive marble. He looked around the lobby of Blackwood Global with a mixture of nostalgia and confusion. To him, this building wasn't a monument to greed. It was the physical manifestation of the dreams he and his son had discussed over cheap dinners years ago. He clutched his leather briefcase, the stitching frayed at the corners, as if it contained the crown jewels. In reality, it held a handwritten financial analysis he'd prepared for Ethan, a small contribution he hoped would still be useful. "Can I help you, sir? Or are you lost?" The receptionist's voice was polite, but her eyes scanned Samuel's sweater with the clinical detachment of a jeweler spotting a flaw. "I'm here to see the chief executive," Samuel said, his voice steady and dignified. "I was told I could find him on the 80th floor. Do you have an appointment?" "No," Samuel admitted, a small, hopeful smile touching his lips. "But I think he'll want to see me." The receptionist's professional mask slipped, replaced by a flicker of pity. "Sir, Mr. Hargreave doesn't see anyone without a 3-week lead time. Especially not walk-ins." From 20 feet away, Ethan moved his mop in a slow, agonizing arc. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to drop the bucket, sweep his father into a hug, and escort him into the private elevator. But the ghost had to remain a ghost. He watched as Samuel thanked the girl and walked toward the seating area, his shoulders slightly more slumped than they had been a moment ago. Samuel didn't see the janitor. He didn't see his son. He sat down on a stark, white leather sofa that looked like it had been designed to discourage anyone from staying too long. He looked small in the vastness of the atrium, a man of substance in a world of surfaces. Then, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. The sound of forced laughter spilled out, followed by the sharp, rhythmic click of Italian leather on stone. Victor Hargreave emerged, flanked by a phalanx of nervous assistants. He was checking his watch, his face twisted in a permanent scowl of manufactured busyness. Samuel stood up, his eyes brightening. He stepped into the path of the moving entourage. Victor? Victor Hargreave? It's Samuel Blackwood. I don't know if you remember me from the founding gala, but I have some thoughts on the new acquisition's debt structure. Victor stopped dead. The assistants froze behind him like a row of falling dominoes. He looked Samuel up and down, his gaze lingering on the worn leather of the briefcase with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. 10 feet away, the mop in Ethan's hands stopped moving. The air in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. The ghost leaned into the shadows, his eyes turning into chips of flint. The trap was set, and Victor Hargreave was about to walk right into it. The heavy, double-paned glass of the executive floor usually muffled the sounds of the world below, but inside the summit, the silence was now broken by the sharp, grating sound of Victor Hargreave's laughter. It was a cold, hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. Ethan shifted his weight, leaning into the shadow cast by a massive marble pillar. From his vantage point, he wasn't just a janitor. He was a silent adjudicator. He watched through the reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows, seeing the world as a predator sees a target. Victor stood over Samuel, his tailored suit jacket pulled tight, emphasizing his aggressive posture. Samuel Blackwood, Victor sneered, the name sounding like an insult in his mouth. The legendary consultant. I heard stories about you when I was in business school, Samuel. Stories about ethics and long-term stability. Tell me, did those ethics pay for that sweater? Or did you find it in the same bargain bin as that pathetic briefcase? Samuel didn't flinch, though his grip tightened on the leather handle. I came to offer a perspective on the debt restructuring, Victor. The current trajectory is none of your concern. Victor interrupted, stepping closer until he was inches from the older man's face. You're a relic. A ghost of a company that doesn't exist anymore. Ethan Blackwood might have had a soft spot for your dignified approach, but Ethan isn't here. I am. Ethan's knuckles turned white against the aluminum handle of his mop. He watched as Victor's assistants snickered behind their hands, a chorus of sycophants feeding off the CEO's cruelty. This was the rot he had sensed from the lobby, a culture where age was a weakness and kindness was a liability. Ethan focused on Victor's reflection. He saw the insecurity behind the arrogance, the way Victor glanced at the boardroom doors as if afraid the real owner might walk through them at any moment. Victor was a man who ruled by fear because he lived in fear. You're cluttering up my floor, Samuel, Victor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. And I don't like clutter. It ruins the aesthetic of success. He turned his head slightly, his eyes scanning the hallway until they landed on the janitor, standing in the shadows. A slow, malicious grin spread across Victor's face. He saw a way to truly break the old man's spirit. Hey you, janitor, Victor barked, snapping his fingers at Ethan. Stop hiding in the dark and get over here. I have some trash that needs to be removed from my sight. Ethan didn't move immediately. He let the moment stretch, the tension in the hallway thickening like industrial glue. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace that didn't belong to a cleaning man, he stepped out of the shadows. The ghost was moving into the light, and Victor Hargreave had no idea he had just summoned his own executioner. Ethan stepped into the harsh, clinical light of the center floor, the wheels of his mop bucket emitting a low, rhythmic protest that grated against the silence. He stopped 3 feet from Victor, his posture slightly stooped, his eyes averted in the practiced submission of a man who knew his place. But beneath the gray fabric of his uniform, his muscles were coiled like a high-tension wire. Victor didn't even look at Ethan's face. He looked at the mop, then back at Samuel, a cruel inspiration gleaming in his eyes. You see this, Samuel? This is the only consultant I need on this floor. Someone who knows how to scrub away the filth. Victor reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick, leather-bound contract, the merger agreement for the Salvero acquisition. It was a document representing billions in potential revenue, yet Victor held it like a weapon. With a flick of his wrist, he fanned the pages out, the scent of fresh ink and expensive vellum filling the air. You came here to talk about debt structures? About the human cost of this merger? Victor sneered, stepping onto the very edge of Samuel's personal space. He took the pen from his pocket, a custom-made fountain pen with a gold nib, and held it over the signature line. Watch closely. This is how power works in the modern world. It's not about heritage or dignity. It's about the ink. In one aggressive motion, Victor scribbled a jagged, arrogant signature across the bottom of the page. He didn't just sign it. He pressed so hard the nib tore slightly into the paper, a symbolic act of dominance. He then held the document up, inches from Samuel's tired eyes. The deal is done. Your legacy is officially overwritten. You're not a consultant, Samuel. You're a memory. Victor's gaze flicked to Ethan. And you. Don't just stand there like a statue. The old man brought some grit into my office. Clean it up. He dropped the torn, signed page onto the floor at Samuel's feet, right next to the dirty mop water. It was the ultimate insult, billions of dollars in ink treated like common refuse. Samuel looked down at the paper, his shoulders shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the disrespect. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the document, soaking up a bead of gray water on the marble. He saw the jagged signature, the mark of a man who thought he was untouchable. The ink is still wet, Mr. Hargreave, Ethan said. His voice was no longer gravelly or subservient. It was smooth, cold, and carried a resonance that made the assistants in the back of the room look up in sudden, sharp alarm. Victor froze, his head snapping toward the janitor. What did you say to me? Ethan finally looked up. For the first time, he let the ghost vanish, allowing the full, terrifying weight of the Blackwood lineage to burn through his eyes. I said the ink is still wet. And in this building, no contract is valid until the owner sees the blood behind the ink. The temperature in the executive suite didn't just drop, it solidified. Victor Hargreave stiffened, his head pivoting toward the janitor with the slow, mechanical precision of a man who couldn't believe his own ears. The assistants behind him stopped breathing. In the hyper-manicured world of Blackwood Global, the help didn't speak unless spoken to, and they certainly didn't speak in the baritone of a man who owned the building. What did you say? Victor's voice was a low, dangerous hiss. He stepped away from Samuel, redirecting his venom toward the man in the gray uniform. You've got a lot of nerve for someone whose job description involves scraping gum off the bottom of desks. Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply leaned his mop against the marble pillar, a gesture that felt less like a janitor resting and more like a knight setting down his lance. I said the contract is invalid, Ethan repeated, his voice echoing off the floor-to-ceiling glass. You're signing away 40% of this company's liquid assets to a firm that has been laundering Salvero blood money for a decade. It's not a merger, Victor. It's a funeral, and you're the one holding the shovel. Victor's face went from pale to a mottled, ugly purple. Who the hell do you think you're talking to? I am the CEO of this firm. I am the man who decides if you eat tomorrow. He turned to his head of security, a hulking man in a black suit standing near the boardroom. Drake, why is this trash still talking? Throw him out, and take the old man with him. I want them both on the sidewalk in the next 60 seconds. Drake stepped forward, his hand reaching for Ethan's shoulder. But before the guard could make contact, Ethan moved. It wasn't a violent movement, but a calculated one. He caught Drake's wrist in a grip that had been forged in years of underground boxing and high-stakes discipline. The security guard gasped, his knees buckling under a pressure point he hadn't seen coming. Wait, Samuel whispered, his tired eyes widening as he looked at the janitor's profile. He saw the sharp jawline, the controlled posture, and the fire in the eyes that he hadn't seen since the day his son had left to build his empire in secret. Ethan. Victor froze. The name hit him like a physical blow. He looked from the slumped guard to the janitor, then back to the signature on the floor. Ethan, don't be ridiculous. This is a janitor. A nobody. Ethan released the guard, who stumbled back, clutching his wrist. Ethan reached up to the collar of his gray uniform. With a slow, deliberate motion, he unzipped the front, revealing a high-end, charcoal gray tactical shirt beneath. He reached into the hidden pocket near his ribs and pulled out a sleek, titanium master key card embossed with a single golden bee. The problem with looking down on everyone, Victor, Ethan said, stepping over the signed contract as if it were nothing more than the litter it was, is that you never see the person who's actually holding the floor up. The air in the executive suite didn't just turn cold. It became vacuum-sealed, a breathless space where the only sound was the frantic thumping of Victor's heart. He looked at the golden bee on the titanium card, then at the man holding it. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but his arrogance was a corner he had backed himself into. I don't care what card you're holding, Victor roared, his voice cracking with a desperate manic edge. You're a janitor. You've been mopping my floors for months. You're nothing but a spy, a liar, and a failure who couldn't even keep his own father in a decent sweater. Victor pointed a trembling finger at the floor, specifically at his own leather loafers, which were splattered with a few drops of the dirty mop water Ethan had been using. You want to talk about legacies? You want to talk about who owns what? Victor's eyes were bloodshot, his sanity fraying at the edges. I am the CEO. I am the face of this company. And you are the help. If you want to keep this little undercover stunt from ending in a lawsuit that will bury you, you'll finish the job you started. He stepped toward Ethan, his shadow looming over the signature on the floor. Get on your knees, Mr. Blackwood. Get on your knees and shine my shoes. Show everyone in this room that no matter whose name is on the building, you are still the man who handles the filth. The boardroom assistants gasped. Samuel took a step forward, his face etched with pain. Victor, stop this. You don't know what you're doing. Shut up, old man. Victor snapped, never taking his eyes off Ethan. Well, I'm waiting. Prove you're the big boss. Prove you have the humility your father is so proud of. Scrub the dirt off my feet, or I'll have the police arrest you both for corporate espionage and trespassing before the sun sets. Ethan looked down at Victor's shoes. He looked at the dirty mop resting against the pillar. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. The kind of smile a reaper might give a man who had finally run out of time. He didn't move toward the shoes. Instead, he reached out and took his father's hand, pulling Samuel to stand firmly beside him. Humility is a virtue, Victor, Ethan said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than the CEO's screaming. But you've confused humility with silence. I've spent 6 months cleaning your floors, listening to you treat people like objects. I've watched you turn my father's dream into a nightmare. Ethan leaned in, his eyes locking onto Victor's with a predatory stillness. I'm not getting on my knees for you. But by the time I'm done, you'll realize that the only thing you're CEO of is an empty chair and a mountain of debt. The silence in the room was no longer the quiet of a corporate office. It was the heavy, breathless stillness of a courtroom just before the verdict. Ethan's hand, still resting on his father's shoulder, was the only thing keeping his fury anchored. Beneath the gray canvas of his sleeves, his forearms were corded with tension, the skin tight over knuckles that yearned to close into a fist. For 6 months, Ethan had been a student of the shadows. He had swallowed insults from men like Victor who weren't fit to hold his father's briefcase. He had felt the sting of being ignored, the casual cruelty of being treated like a ghost. But seeing Victor attempt to weaponize that humility, to demand that the son humiliate himself at the feet of the man who had just spat on his father, broke the final seal on Ethan's restraint. His internal rage wasn't a wildfire, it was a glacier, cold, slow, and unstoppable. He thought of the late nights his father had spent teaching him that a leader's true strength was found in how he protected those who could do nothing for him. Victor hadn't just insulted a man, he had insulted the very foundation of the Blackwood legacy. You think you're a king because you sit in a chair I paid for, Ethan said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a lethal clarity that made the glass windows hum. You think power is the ability to make a man kneel. But true power is the ability to walk away from the throne and still have men follow you. You, Victor, wouldn't be followed out of a burning building. Ethan stepped forward, moving into Victor's personal space. He didn't raise his hands, but the sheer force of his presence forced Victor to stumble back. The CEO's heels caught on the edge of the very document he had signed, the blood and ink, now nothing more than scrap paper beneath the janitor's boots. Look at your hands, Victor, Ethan commanded. Victor looked down, his fingers trembling. They're clean. Too clean, Ethan hissed. You've never built anything. You've only managed the decay. You asked for a shoe shine? I'll give you something better. I'll give you a front row seat to the moment you become as invisible as I was 5 minutes ago. Ethan reached for the radio clipped to his belt, the one the staff thought was for reporting spills. He keyed the mic. Security, this is Blackwood. Code Omega. Lock down the executive floor and bring the board of directors to the summit. Now, the radio crackled with an immediate, terrified, yes, sir. Victor's jaw dropped. The realization finally took hold. The janitor's grip wasn't just on a mop, it was around the throat of his entire career. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom didn't just open. They were thrown wide by security detail in a way that signaled a shift in the building's gravitational pull. A procession of the company's most powerful figures filed out. Men and women who controlled global markets, now looking like chastened school children. They lined the perimeter of the executive floor, forming a gallery of expensive wool and terrified silence. They were the elite, the witnesses to the culture Victor had built. For months, they had walked past the janitor without a second glance, laughing at Victor's jokes and ignoring the quiet decay of the company's ethics. Now, as they saw Ethan Blackwood standing in the center of the room, half shrouded in a janitor's uniform, half revealed as a titan, the air became thick with the smell of their collective fear. Victor looked to them, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for a single ally. "Don't just stand there," he shrieked, his voice cracking against the silence. "This man is a fraud. He's been spying on us. He's compromised the security of this entire firm. Marcus, Elena, tell him he's fired." But the board members remained frozen. They weren't looking at Victor anymore. They were looking at Ethan's eyes, the same eyes that stared out from the oil paintings in the lobby. They saw the janitor reach out and gently take the leather briefcase from Samuel's hand, a gesture of profound respect that made the onlookers flinch with guilt. "You all saw it," Ethan said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the floor. "You watched a man who helped build the foundations of your careers be treated like a trespasser. You watched a CEO demand a humiliation that has no place in this century. And not one of you moved." The silence of the elite was their confession. Ethan turned back to Victor, who was now backed against the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city of Chicago looming behind him like a judge. "Your board won't save you, Victor. They're too busy calculating how to explain their own silence to the man who signs their bonuses." Ethan let the master key card dangle from his fingers before dropping it onto the mahogany desk. The sound of the plastic hitting the wood was as loud as a gavel. "The observation period is over. Now, the witnesses are going to watch me do what you should have done an hour ago." He looked toward the elevators, which chimed in unison. The summit was no longer a sanctuary for the arrogant. It had become a cage, and the true owner was finally holding the light. Ethan didn't move with the frantic energy of the panicked men around him. He moved with the terrifying calmness of a storm that had finally made landfall. He reached out and gripped the handle of the mop, the symbol of his 6-month penance, and lifted it from the marble pillar. For a heartbeat, Victor thought he was finally going to obey. A flicker of triumph crossed the CEO's face, a belief that the uniform still held power over the man. "That's it," Victor whispered, his voice trembling with a sickly hope. "Do your job. Clean the floor. Be the nobody you are." Instead, Ethan let go. The mop didn't fall softly. It hit the polished floor with a sharp, echoing clack that sounded like a gunshot in the silent atrium. The gray water splashed across Victor's expensive shoes, soaking into the fine leather. But Ethan didn't even look down. He stepped over the fallen tool, his height suddenly imposing, his presence filling every inch of the executive suite. "The job is done, Victor," Ethan said, his voice dropping the last of its gravelly disguise. It was now a blade of pure authority. "I didn't come here to clean the floors. I came to see if there was anything left in this company worth saving." He reached up and tore the Velcro name tag from his chest, Ethan, and let it flutter to the floor like a dead leaf. As he did, the heavy silence of the board members shifted into a frantic, hushed whispering. They recognized the movement, the tilt of the head, the sheer gravity of the man standing before them. Ethan turned to the head of security, who was still nursing his bruised wrist. "Drake, take Mr. Hargreaves' access badge. He won't be needing it to find the exit." "You can't do this," Victor screamed, his back hitting the floor-to-ceiling glass as he realized the board was looking at him with the same cold detachment they usually reserved for a failing stock. "I have a contract. I have rights. You have a signature on a wet piece of paper sitting in a puddle of dirty water," Ethan countered, stepping so close that Victor could see the steel in his eyes. "And you have 60 seconds to leave this building before I have you escorted out in the same zip ties you were planning to use on my father." The turning point was absolute. The janitor was gone. The billionaire was back. And as Ethan placed a protective arm around Samuel, the board of directors collectively bowed their heads. Not out of respect, but out of the sudden, terrifying realization that the man who had been cleaning their trash for months now knew every single one of their secrets. The silence that followed the clatter of the mop was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the chests of everyone in the room. Ethan didn't look at the mess on the floor. He didn't look at the board members who were suddenly trying to remember if they had ever been rude to the man with the bucket. His eyes were locked on Victor, watching the man's world collapse in real time. Slowly, Ethan reached into the heavy, reinforced pocket of his utility belt. He didn't pull out a cleaning rag or a spray bottle. He pulled out a slim, obsidian black case. When he clicked it open, The light from the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the surface of a master key card that didn't belong to a janitor, a manager, or even a CEO. It was the founder's key. The card was made of a rare, brushed alloy, inlaid with a microscopic circuit of 24-karat gold that formed the Blackwood crest. It was the only physical object in the world that could override every lock, every server, and every bank account tied to Blackwood Global. You spent so much time looking down, Victor, that you forgot to look at the hierarchy, Ethan said, his voice ringing with a terrifying, calm authority. You thought this uniform was my identity. You thought Samuel was just an old man. You failed the only test that mattered. He stepped toward the central console on the mahogany desk, the nerve center of the office. With a smooth, practiced motion, he swiped the card. The room's haptic lights flickered from a cold corporate blue to a deep, authoritative crimson. Every screen in the room, from the stock tickers to the personal tablets of the board members, went dark for a split second before displaying a single message in white text. Root access granted. Welcome back, Mr. Blackwood. The gasp that went through the room was collective. Victor staggered back, his hand hitting the glass wall as if trying to find an exit that no longer existed. You're him, Victor whispered, the realization finally breaking through his shock. The ghost founder. The man who disappeared 6 months ago. I didn't disappear, Victor. I was right here, Ethan said, taking a step into the light, his shadow stretching long across the marble. I was watching you burn my father's legacy for the sake of your ego. You wanted to see how power works. This is it. Power isn't the suit you wear or the people you humiliate. Power is the man who owns the air you're breathing. Ethan turned the card over in his fingers, the gold crest glinting like a predator's eye. And right now, Victor, you're breathing my air for free. That ends today. The digital humming of the room reached a crescendo as Ethan's founder-level access stripped Victor of his borrowed majesty. Across the panoramic screens of the executive floor, Victor's face was being systematically deleted from the corporate directory. His email, his clearance, and his authority were vanishing in a cascade of red text. Ethan didn't shout. He didn't need to. He stood behind the massive mahogany desk, the seat of power Victor had occupied like a squatter, and looked at the man who had dared to insult his blood. You called this the summit, Victor, Ethan said, his voice as cold and precise as an architect's blueprint. But you didn't build it. You just sat on the peak and threw stones at the people climbing up. You mistook a temporary appointment for a permanent throne. Victor was hyperventilating now, his clean-cut beard twitching. You can't just. I have a golden parachute. My contract guarantees $100 million exit. Ethan picked up the ink-stained merger agreement from the floor, the one Victor had signed with such arrogant flourish. He held it up between two fingers. This contract was predicated on your fiduciary duty to Blackwood Global. By signing a deal with a Salvero-linked shell company, you didn't just fail this company, you committed treason against it. I've already sent the encrypted files to the SEC and the Department of Justice. Your golden parachute just turned into a lead weight. The board members shifted, moving as far away from Victor as the walls would allow. They were predators, and they could smell a carcass. Victor Hogreave, Ethan continued, his eyes locking onto the cowering man. You are terminated for cause, effective 60 seconds ago. You will leave this building with nothing but the suit you're wearing, the one you think makes you a man. He turned to the security detail. Escort him out. Not through the executive elevator. Take him through the service hall. Let him see the people he called clutter on his way to the curb. The two guards, who had spent the morning taking orders from Victor, didn't hesitate. They grabbed Victor by the arms. The former CEO let out a strangled cry of protest, but it was useless. As he was dragged toward the back exit, his expensive loafers squeaked against the marble, leaving a pathetic trail in the very water Ethan had mopped only an hour before. Ethan watched until the service doors swung shut. Then the silence returned, but this time it was clean. He turned to the board members, who were standing like statues. Now, Ethan said, the janitor's calm returning to his face. Let's talk about the rest of the trash on this floor. The tension that had suffocated the room for hours finally broke, replaced by a quiet, reverent awe. Ethan turned away from the glass windows and the ghost of Victor's career, his gaze softening as it landed on the man standing by the sofa. Samuel Blackwood stood with his shoulders squared, his humble brown sweater a badge of honor in a room full of hollow suits. He looked at his son, not at the billionaire or the architect of a corporate execution, but at the man who had stayed true to the values they had shared in a tiny apartment decades ago. The chair is empty, Dad, Ethan said, his voice warm and devoid of the lethal edge it had held moments before. He gestured toward the massive mahogany desk, the seat that had been used as a throne of intimidation. But it was never meant for someone like Victor. It was built on the blueprints you drew up when I was just a boy. Ethan walked to his father and took the frayed leather briefcase. Instead of setting it aside, he placed it squarely in the center of the executive desk. It was a symbolic reclamation. The board members watched in stunned silence as the janitor escorted the retired consultant to the head of the table. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Ethan announced, his voice projecting to the furthest corners of the floor. "You've spent the last 6 months following a man who didn't know the difference between an asset and a soul. Today, that change becomes permanent. I am appointing Samuel Blackwood as the Chairman Emeritus of the Ethics and Integrity Committee. No deal, no merger, and no signature moves forward in this company without his seal of approval." A ripple of uneasy applause began, led by Marcus, who was sweating profusely. Ethan silenced them with a single, sharp glance. "You're not clapping for him," Ethan said coldly. "You're clapping because you're relieved I haven't looked at your expense reports yet. If you want to keep your seats, you will show this man the respect he earned 40 years before you learned how to tie a Windsor knot." Samuel sat in the chair, his hands resting on the cool wood. He looked up at Ethan, a tear glinting in the corner of his eye. "You didn't have to do this, Ethan. I just wanted to help with the debt structure." Ethan leaned down and kissed his father's forehead. "You helped with the only structure that mattered, Dad. You kept the foundation solid. The legacy wasn't just restored, it was fortified. The summit was no longer a cold peak of arrogance, it was finally home. The transition from the ghost to the founder was absolute, but the work was far from over." Ethan didn't just want Victor gone. He wanted the corruption he had fostered to be incinerated. While Samuel sat at the mahogany desk, a beacon of rediscovered dignity, Ethan stepped back into the center of the room, his presence commandingly sharp against the backdrop of the terrified board. "I spent 6 months cleaning the floors of this building," Ethan began, his voice echoing with a cold, rhythmic precision. "And I found that the dirt on the marble was nothing compared to the dirt in your ledgers." He tapped a command into his handheld device, and the panoramic screens surrounding the room shifted. Rows of encrypted data began to unfurl. Wire transfers, offshore accounts, and the hidden kickbacks Victor had distributed to ensure the board's silence. The elite of Blackwood Global watched as their private greeds were laid bare in high definition. "Every one of you who looked the other way while Victor negotiated with the Salvero fronts is under review," Ethan stated. "My legal team has been working from a secure basement for 3 months. As of 5 minutes ago, the cleaning house protocol has been initiated." The room erupted into a flurry of hushed, panicked excuses, but Ethan silenced them with a raised hand. "There will be no golden parachutes. There will be no quiet resignations. Those who were complicit will face the full weight of the DOJ. Those who were simply cowards." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the trembling managers. "You have 1 week to prove why you deserve to walk through these doors again." Outside, the faint sound of sirens began to wail, rising from the city streets toward the summit. Ethan looked at the board members, then at the service elevator where Victor had been hauled away. The cleaning house wasn't just a metaphor anymore. He walked back to his father's side, placing a hand on the back of the chairman's chair. The corporate rot was being excised with surgical finality. For the first time in half a year, Ethan felt the air in the building grow light. The atmosphere of fear was being replaced by the scent of accountability. The janitor had finished his final shift, and the empire was finally truly clean. The surgical lights of the executive floor dimmed, replaced by the warm, amber glow of the setting sun bleeding through the Chicago fog. The chaos of the arrests and the frantic scrubbing of the legal teams had moved to the floors below, leaving the summit in a state of rare, profound peace. Ethan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he wasn't wearing the gray canvas uniform anymore. He had changed into a tailored black suit that fit his athletic frame like armor, yet he kept the sleeves rolled up, a quiet nod to the work that had brought him here. Beside him stood Samuel, his father's hand resting on the railing, looking out over the sprawling grid of lights that made up the city they had conquered together. "It looks different from up here, doesn't it?" Samuel asked softly. "When we were on the ground, the buildings looked like mountains. From here, they just look like possibilities." Ethan nodded, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "I forgot that for a while, Dad. I got so caught up in the architecture of the empire that I forgot who the rooms were built for." 6 months with a mop taught me more about this company than 6 years in the boardroom. The city below began to shimmer as the streetlights flickered on. The rot had been cut away, the pretenders had been cast down, and the foundation was set in stone. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the old, frayed leather briefcase. He handed it back to Samuel, but this time he had attached a new brass tag to the handle. S. Blackwood, Chairman Emeritus. "We have a lot of work to do tomorrow," Ethan said, his voice reflecting the calm authority of a man who no longer needed to hide. "But tonight the view is ours." Samuel smiled, a look of absolute pride illuminating his tired eyes. He didn't see the billionaire, and he didn't see the janitor. He saw the son who had learned that true height isn't measured by the floor you live on, but by the people you refuse to look down upon. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the two men stood as silent sentinels over Chicago. The ghost had finally come home, and for the first time in its history, the view from the top was perfectly clear.